Hello everyone, and welcome to A Teacher Explains.
Today, we're going way back to the early days of communication theory. This was a time when mass media was seen as this incredibly powerful, direct, and honestly even a dangerous new force. We're going to explore how big ideas like mass society theory and propaganda really grew out of periods of massive social and political change. And at the heart of all of this is a really big question, one that we are absolutely still wrestling with today. Should the media be used to control us, for our own good? Or should it be a tool to educate us, to empower us? This basic conflict is the thread we're going to follow all the way through this explainer. So, here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll dive into that initial widespread fear of mass media. Then, we'll get into the so-called science of persuasion and propaganda. After that, we'll unpack the huge debate over the media's role in a democracy. And finally, we'll connect the dots and see why these century-old ideas are still so important today. Okay, let's start with part one, the fear of mass media. To really get a feel for why these powerful theories popped up, you have to understand the general sense of anxiety that was in the air at the time. So I want you to just picture it. The world is changing at lightning speed. People are leaving small towns for big, crowded cities, so traditional communities are starting to fall apart. And at the exact same time, you have these incredible new technologies everywhere: newspapers, radio, movies. Then World War I hits, and propaganda is used on a scale nobody had ever seen before. It was a time of huge uncertainty, and a lot of people in power started to worry that the media could be used to manipulate a public that seemed more isolated and vulnerable than ever before. And all of that fear gave birth to something called mass society theory. The core idea is actually pretty simple. As we become more disconnected from our traditional communities, we become way more susceptible to being influenced by the mass media. In this view, media isn't just a way to share information, it's a powerful tool for social control. Mass society theory is really built on 6 main assumptions. First, the media is so powerful it can tear down social norms, so the elites need to control it. Second, media messages act like a magic bullet. They hit us directly and immediately change how we think and act. Third, this influence is ultimately bad for society. Fourth, we're all vulnerable because we're cut off from each other. Fifth, if things get too chaotic, a totalitarian government might be the only answer. And finally, number 6, mass media is basically just junk food for the brain that's destroying high culture. It's a pretty dark and pessimistic view of the modern world, right? A lot of this thinking was influenced by the sociologist Ferdinand Tönnies. He described 2 kinds of social life. There's Gemeinschafts, which is that traditional, tight-knit community where everyone knows everyone. And then there's Gesellschafts, which is our modern, impersonal, fragmented society. The fear was that in moving from one to the other, we lost those strong social bonds that protected us, leaving us wide open to media manipulation. So the big question became, how do they think this manipulation actually worked? What were the mechanics of it? Well, that brings us right to our next section, the science of persuasion and the rise of propaganda. Now, propaganda is all about using communication to sway what people think and do, but it's not all one thing. You've got black propaganda, which is just straight-up deception, total lies. Then there's white propaganda, which is more about promoting a particular viewpoint by carefully selecting information. It might not be false, but it's definitely not the whole story. And then you have gray propaganda, which is kind of murky. You don't know who the source is, or you're not sure if the information is true. So you can see it's a whole spectrum of techniques. So what made people back then think propaganda could be so effective? Well, they were leaning on a couple of big psychological theories of the day. The first was behaviorism. This theory basically sees humans as simple stimulus response machines, like Pavlov's dogs. The media provides the stimulus, the message, and the audience just reacts predictably, almost automatically, without any real conscious thought. And the other major influence was Freudianism. The idea here is that our minds are split between the rational part, our ego, and our primal emotional desires, our id. Propagandists believed they could craft messages that would totally bypass our rational defenses and appeal directly to those deep, unconscious urges. It was like they thought they had found a secret backdoor to the human mind. Okay, so as you can imagine, all these ideas about media being this all-powerful tool for manipulation led to a massive debate. What should the media's role in society actually be? And that brings us to our third section, 2 competing visions for media in a democracy. So on one side of the debate, you had thinkers like Lasswell. He was actually pretty pessimistic about democracy. He worried that public debate would just lead to conflict and chaos. So what was his solution? Something he called democratic propaganda. I know, it sounds like a contradiction, right? But his idea was that an elite group of scientific experts should use propaganda to manage public opinion and keep society from falling apart. And right there with him was the incredibly influential journalist Walter Lippmann. He didn't mince words. He argued that the world was just too complicated for the average person to understand. He famously called the public a bewildered herd that needed to be guided by a small class of experts. He believed this was the only way to protect society from its own ignorance. But, and this is a huge but, not everyone agreed with this dark view. On the complete other side of the argument was the philosopher John Dewey. He saw things in a totally different light. Where Lippmann saw a bewildered herd, Dewey saw a public that was perfectly capable of learning and thinking for itself. For Dewey, the media shouldn't be a tool for control. It should be a tool for education, a public forum for debate. This was a fundamental disagreement about what democracy even means. So what's the legacy of all this? I mean, these are old theories, right? Why are we still talking about them 100 years later? That's what we're going to get into in our final section. All right, so let's assess these early theories. On the one hand, they weren't all wrong. They were right to point out that media is powerful, and they were onto something huge when they recognized that emotion and psychology play a massive role in persuasion. But they had a major blind spot. They saw audiences as completely passive, like sponges just soaking up media messages. They really underestimated our ability to think for ourselves, to interpret, and even to resist what we see and hear. But even with those flaws, these ideas are still so incredibly relevant today. I mean, just think about all the conversations we have about misinformation, fake news, the power of political advertising, or how we should regulate the internet. All of these modern anxieties echo those early debates. These theories really laid the groundwork for how we study and think about the media's effect on all of us. And that brings us to a final, really critical question that we have to ask ourselves right now. That old debate between Lippmann and Dewey, that clash between control and education, it's not just history. In our age of social media feeds and powerful algorithms, the question of who decides what information we see and why is more urgent than it has ever been. If you want to dive deeper into any of this, these are the sources that we drew from for this explainer.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel.